Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar today, where Christine Wenzel is going to be talking about what the district does to protect wetlands in our community. Who, what, where, and you. She'll give us a fabulous overview of what wetlands are, how the district works to protect those wetlands, what you can do, and just to give you an idea of why are wetlands so important. A couple of housekeeping pieces. You will all be in listen-only mode throughout the presentation, but we do hope to get questions from you. So you are able to enter those in that question pane in your control panel. You can click on that little arrow and it'll drop down and you can type your questions in. We will save the questions for the end of the presentation and do hope that there are some questions that come about. Without any further ado, Christine, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I appreciate you. I am so thankful that you all have decided to join us. I am Christine Wenzel. I have been with the St. Johns River Water Management District for a little over 27 years. And during that time frame, I have been in our regulatory program. The district does a lot of different things, but I have focused my career on our regulatory program for that entire time. With this presentation, I'm hopeful that I'll be able to shed a little bit of light on what wetlands are and how we can go about protecting them and what the district does to protect them. I'm going to start off with what is a wetland. This definition is from chapter 62.340. That is the regulatory authority under which the Water Management District works. And this definition is a whole lot of words to say that wetlands are areas that are either inundated or saturated for a duration long enough to support wetland vegetation. And as a result of that inundation or saturation, there are certain hydric soil characteristics that come about. I'm going to go through details. I'm going to go through the details of how we define wetlands a little bit more as we get into the presentation, because we do that in the real world. We're not doing that. We're utilizing different tools that we have, such as historic aerial photographs, soil surveys, elevation models, those kind of things. But we have to define where that wetland is out in the real world. But I wanted to start off by showing you several different types of wetlands. There are all different types of wetlands here in Florida and across the world. But Florida Natural Areas Inventory has defined those natural communities that we have here in Florida. I've given you a website if you'd like to take a look at that. There are Florida Natural Areas Inventory defines not just wetlands, but they define upland communities. It gives you the typical vegetation you find, what part of the state you might find these wetland communities or upland communities in, and what might be unique about them relative to their soil or their topography or resource value for those areas. So the types of wetlands that we often see, and I think that most folks are aware of as they drive by a particular area, are things like cypress domes and cypress strands. There are a variety of different types of cypress domes and strands. Some have denser canopy vegetation, more trees. Some are more open, as I've shown on this photograph. We have our tidal salt marshes that you see associated with a lot of our riverine systems. Those marshes have all kinds of resources. We see a lot of wildlife. I'm up here in Jacksonville, so we have a lot of marshes associated with the St. Johns River and the Nassau River. So that's a community type that is something that folks point to when they say, what is a wetland? Another wetland that's maybe not as common in your everyday knowledge is a wet prairie. We have a lot of wet prairies in the state. Here's a beautiful picture, and this particular type of wetland is something that's very, very productive. There's a lot of wildlife utilization in a wet prairie. But not all wetlands are wet. And this is a photograph of pine flatwoods. Pine flatwoods can be both mesic, which is on the upland side, or hydric, which is on the wetland side. And they may not have wetland, or they might not have standing water in them for given periods of time or at all. There are also freshwater marshes that we have that are considered wetlands, but they're not always inundated or saturated. Inundated meaning there's water standing above the surface. Saturated meaning the water is below the ground surface, but near the ground surface. So some of these community types never have standing water in them. And so a lot of folks think, well, they wouldn't be a wetland if they don't have standing water, but that's not the case. As we look at how we define a wetland, once again, we're going out there in the real world and we're looking at the site itself. And when we delineate a wetland, we are trying to draw a line that defines the wetland on one side and the upland on the other side. We're using reasonable scientific judgment as we implement Chapter 62.340 of the Florida Administrative Code. That is the rule that we've been given. That rule is very elaborate, so I'm going to paraphrase it as we go through this presentation just to give you the highlights. When we look at Chapter 62.340 and try to define that wetland, we're looking at three things. We're looking at the vegetation that's in that community, we're looking at the soils, and we're looking at hydrologic indicators. And I'm going to go through each one of those categories to tell you a little bit about what they are. When we look at vegetation, we're looking at the canopy, which are the trees. It's everything that is greater than 4 inches diameter at breast height. And we are looking at the type of species that we have in the canopy. We're also looking at the understory, which is vegetation that's usually known as shrubs. Or small trees, things that are less than 4 inches diameter of breast height and greater than 1 inch. And then everything that is less than 1 inch diameter of breast height or doesn't reach 4 feet is considered ground cover. And so we are taking into consideration the species that are in each one of these strata. When we look at the species, Chapter 62.340 defines species that are in wetlands for given periods of or given frequencies, and we categorize them as obligate, facultative wet, or facultative. And we define whether a particular plant species is obligate or facultative wet or facultative by the frequency in which it is found in a wetland. All of that designation has been done for us under Chapter 62.340, but it is all based on science. We, in development of the rule, we looked at what the frequency of these species were relative to wetlands, and that's how they got their classification. When we're looking, oh, I'm so sorry. When we're looking at wetlands, we're also looking at hydric soils. We are looking at the presence of groundwater relative to the soil surface. When we have groundwater either at or near the ground surface, that causes anaerobic conditions. Those anaerobic conditions result in changes or identifiable characteristics in the soil. And those identifiable characteristics are something that is detailed out in Chapter 62.340. So we dig holes when we're out there and we are defining where that wetland upland line is to see if we are finding these hydric soil characteristics. These characteristics develop in the soil, but they might not always come to the soil surface. It depends on the type of soil, what criteria are utilized to define hydric soils. That gets a little bit more entailed, but I did want to let you know that there's a lot of science behind what characteristics are used to define hydric soils. The last thing we look at are hydrologic indicators. So hydrologic indicators are generally the result of standing water or inundation. We're seeing these, we're seeing evidence that water is moving or is present or was present for given periods of time. These photographs are good examples. The red mangrove puts out prop roots in order to stabilize itself because of the saturation or inundation in the soil. There are drift lines in salt marshes, which show the water has come up to a certain point, deposited materials, whether they be other plant materials, there might be other floating objects that might get deposited, but you can see water came to a certain point and then it's receded and it will return. We have things like elevated lichen lines or water lines on trees that show water was here and it stayed for a duration long enough to basically stain the tree or to deposit material on a tree. Lichen grows on trees that are in the wetland oftentimes, and it cannot tolerate significant durations of inundation. And so when you have water present, standing, it will generally kill off lichens. And so if you have a line that shows you where those lichens died off at, then you can see, okay, water came to this point, it stayed for a duration, and then it receded if it's not there on the day of your site visit. So all of those things, and there are many more hydrologic indicators that we use in the rule, are ways for us to look at the site and determine, yes, wetland, or yes, water is present here and it is staying for a certain duration. Oops. What functions does a wetland have? So we at the Water Management District have rule criteria, and we are trying to implement that rule criteria in order to protect these wetlands. We're protecting these wetlands because they filter pollutants, they store water, they help provide flood, they help prevent flood damage, they recharge the groundwater, they serve as nurseries for fish and shellfish, and their habitat for a whole lot of wildlife and plants. We've got stormwater management systems. You see treatment ponds that are out there that get constructed in order to replace some of the functions that wetlands have on a project site. So our wetland systems are natural treatment systems versus stormwater ponds that we construct in order to replicate that. We have flood events, and the wetlands that we have in areas serve as sponges to absorb a lot of the runoff and the excess rain that we have. When groundwater levels rise, those wetlands are where the water goes and stays, and that's how it is meant to be usually in the topography, because the wetlands are in the lower elevations. And of course, I couldn't resist putting a picture of our otter. Wildlife is a good part of why we do what we do. We want to maintain both water quality and water quantity, but we also want to have habitat for wildlife. So a lot of our protection measures that we'll get into later in the presentation are there so that we have all of these things. We have areas to treat water, we have areas to attenuate or hold water, and we have areas to maintain wildlife. The Environmental Resource Permitting Program here at the Water Management District was implemented and has gone through several changes over the course of years, but basically we're here to make sure that those habitats are maintained. So our rule criteria is designed to ensure that we are protecting wetlands, we're making sure that water quality is maintained, and that we are making sure that we are not, that development isn't going to result in flooding. There are all different types of permits that the Water Management District issues, and most folks need to get permits at some point if they're doing any type of development within the St. Johns River Water Management District. There are 5 water management districts in the state, and between the 5 of us, we've got the whole state covered. So regardless of where you're doing development, if you have tripped a threshold, which is defined by our rule, then you will need to come in and address the rule criteria that deals with wetland impacts, flooding, and treatment for wetlands, or treatment for water quality. Our rule is the statewide ERP. As I said, all 5 water management districts have the same rule. It's found under Chapter 62.330. That rule is very entailed. It deals with all different types of development, all different types of treatment systems, all different types of wetland impacts. We have further guidance on how to implement Chapter 62.330 through the Applicant's Handbook, Volumes 1 and 2. That is just sort of our guide on what the rule criteria in Chapter 62.330 means and how we should implement it in particular cases. Some of you may have heard of the state 404 program being assumed by the state from the Army Corps of Engineers. When a project has impacts to wetlands or surface waters, if those waters have been determined to be waters of the United States, what they call WOTUS, then impacts to those areas might also require federal authorization as well as state authorization. What has happened is the Army Corps of Engineers and Environmental Protection Agency has delegated their permitting authority under 404 for certain types of projects to the state being the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. So we have graphics that indicate what wetlands or water bodies are considered retained and what are considered assumed. And so any wetlands or surface waters, any work that includes wetlands or surface waters that are retained would be reviewed for federal authorization by the Army Corps of Engineers. Any that are considered assumed or outside of retained waters would be reviewed by Florida Department of Environmental Protection. As part of that program, DEP has been, we continue to coordinate with DEP so that we can run the state program in conjunction with the federal program side by side so that folks are worked through the system. What we do when we assess wetlands is we look at an impact and we determine if it's considered adverse. If we think it's adverse, then we implement what we call UMAM, which is the Unified Mitigation Assessment Method. And that's under Chapter 62.345 of the Florida Administrative Code. This assessment method is used for both impacts and mitigation. I'm going to go through this very quickly just because it's very entailed and it's something that we do in the field as part of the permitting process. But I do want you to know that we look at the proposed impact areas and we compare them to a natural community. When we compare them to the natural community that it once was or it most closely replicates, then we start looking at the location and landscape of the proposed impact area or the proposed mitigation. We look at the water environment and we look at the community structure. These are given numbers on a scale of 0 to 10 compared to that natural community. And those numbers are then put into formulas and we get what we call a functional loss for impacts or a functional gain for mitigation. When we look at location and landscape, we're looking at the location and of the proposed impact area and what's around it. So if it's a highly developed area, the location and landscape is lower than a more natural community in a more natural setting. When we look at the water environment, we look to see, is this a natural wetland community? Are there water quality impacts that might have occurred? And once again, there's a whole list of criteria that we're looking at, and I'm paraphrasing. When we look at community structure, is the community structure healthy? Is it what it's supposed to be? Is it stressed? Are there exotic and nuisance species in that structure? And so we want to evaluate that. We also do mitigation. If we do consider there's a functional loss, we look for mitigation, which is compensation. You've got wetland creation, restoration, upland and wetland enhancement, and wetland and upland preservation. So there's a lot of options to offset impacts that are considered adverse. Applicants might also propose to donate land if they have something that the district is interested in accepting as a donation, or they could purchase mitigation bank credits to propose functional loss. So why do we protect these wetlands? We protect them as part of our permitting program to maintain treatment, to maintain storage, and to maintain habitat. That's what our goals are. So we perform this protection through recorded conservation easements, recorded covenants and restrictions, signage, fencing. There might be other options that applicants might propose, but all of those things are tools that we use to ensure that the mitigation associated with a particular project is protected. Where to look to see if there are recorded conservation easements, if there are restrictions on your property. These are all things that could be found in most of the paperwork that you get during your purchase. You often get a survey of your land, you get a title search for your property, you get a copy of the covenants and restrictions associated with your particular subdivision. So these things, these graphics often depict, or documents often depict, where those restrictions may apply. The conservation easement is going to preclude certain activities from happening within the wetlands or the uplands or whatever we have defined as the mitigation. So in this particular case, there is a lot and there are uplands and wetlands on that lot. And so when that person bought that lot, they could see these are the areas where the wetlands are, these are the areas where the upland buffers are, and then they could review the recorded conservation easement in the public records to see what the restrictions are associated with that. Before you buy a piece of property, please, please, please know what you're buying. Know if there are wetlands or surface waters. You might need to hire an environmental consultant in order to let you know that. The state agencies don't have the ability to do that assessment for you. So that's something that most folks do during their due diligence, is hire an environmental consultant to take a look at the site and give some feedback as to what where you are and what might be on the property. You also want to check with your state and county and federal other agencies to make sure that there's no permitting history that you might need to be aware of before you buy a piece of property. And that is a quick, very quick run through of what we do here at the Water Management District and what and why wetlands are so important. I would love to answer any questions that you might have. I have provided my name, my phone number, and my email address on this webinar. So if you have any questions, I am happy to answer them, or if I can't, I can definitely get you to the right person. I did want to acknowledge a couple of folks for some of the photographs that we had in the presentation. And I also want to thank Brittany Scheller, one of my teammates, for all of her help with this presentation.
Thank you so much, Christine, for that fabulous presentation. By the number of questions that we have, it seems like it's a really interesting topic and one that people do have a lot of questions about. So I am going to try and paraphrase these questions so that they incorporate the greatest number of them as possible. The other thing I wanted to say before I start questions is that this presentation has been recorded or is being recorded, and it will be available on our YouTube channel, so you can go back and watch it again. So please do that and share it with others that might be interested. And we also have a lot of other really fabulous topics that are on that YouTube channel. One of the questions that we had that came in was, how does the district and the district's permitting relate or relate with local governments, whether it's the county or the city governments, in terms of, is there a collaboration or working across those different entities?
So when we get an application in-house, I have a co-reviewer, I have an engineering co-reviewer. So there is a lot more collaboration in the rule criteria as it relates to the water quality and water quantity side of applications. There are criteria at the county level that might be more stringent than the water management district, or they might be less stringent. So the applicant is required to meet the most stringent criteria. If there's a conflict, we definitely coordinate. As it relates to the wetland side of things, most of the time the local governments defer to the water management district to deal with the permitting side of impacts and mitigation. A lot of local governments have their own ordinances as it relates to listed species. And so we do coordinate on those listed species. If a particular county has criteria for eagles or for sea turtles or something along those lines, then we definitely incorporate them in our work, in our connection with either the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission or FWS.
Okay, fabulous. So you mentioned how location in the landscape and what type of wetland is important in your consideration. Is there a specific size requirement that wetlands of a certain size are, or how, I guess, is there any sort of size requirement for areas needing permits or being able to be mitigated for versus filled, those type of things?
Yeah, what we do is we look at each project individually. There is certain rule criteria, subsection 10.2.2.1 of the applicant's handbook volume 1 allows for isolated wetlands that are less than a half an acre that meet certain criteria to not need to be mitigated for. Certain upland cut drainage ditches and certain ponds don't need to be mitigated for. But there are very specific criteria that need to be met if that is the case. Other than that, I think most wetlands are going to probably require mitigation unless they are just very, very low quality. But all of that assessment is done on the site and is very, very specific to a particular project area in a particular wetland system. So no, there's not a magic number that says if you're less than an acre, you don't need a permit or you don't need to mitigate or anything like that. There is not one. There are exemptions, and if you meet them, then you might not have to mitigate, but once again, very site specific.
Fabulous. Yeah, and I mean, each wetland is going to be a very unique system. You did mention how stormwater ponds are a great way for water quality to be improved, and wetlands are a great way to improve that water quality, whether they're created wetlands. So one of the questions was about the water quality coming out of those stormwater systems, and if there was any or what the regulation maybe about stormwater ponds not being considered wetlands might be, or if there is some like that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
So as a part of our rule, we're looking for that water coming off a developed site to be treated. The rule has treatment specifications. So when the water goes into a system, and I'll call the pond a system. When it goes into the system has to function to do the treatment per the rule. When the water comes out of the system, it is treated to meet state water quality standards. And that is for not for drinking water, not for potable water. That's for class 3 water standards, water quality standards. And so when there's discharge to the wetlands, we are not considering that discharge an impact because that water has been treated per the state criteria. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes. There are some other questions that do pertain to that local government desire for maybe more stringent regulation. And so who would be then responsible for coming up for that more stringent regulation? Would it be the Board of Commissioners?
So if when I say mine, if the water management district's regulations are not as stringent as a county regulation, I can only permit what my rule criteria allows for. The applicant would then have to meet my criteria, but in order to develop in a particular county, if their criteria is more stringent, then they would need to meet the criteria of the county as well. Now, the county Board of County Commissioners, their planning, their regulatory authority is who will define what the stringency of that criteria is. So we are acting separately. They have their own rules, and how they implement those rules would be the same as how they would implement any other regulations within their county. And they can make the Board of County Commissioners might vote to say, yes, we want more stringent buffer requirements, or we want more stringent water quality requirements, whatever those might be. But that is outside the water management district's purview.
Okay, but you did mention it's the more stringent requirements are the ones that that are required for permitting.
Yes, but not by me. That just inadvertently is what happens. So
right.
In treating for me and then treating for them separately, they will overlap, and we would end up with a more stringent criteria.
Okay. Well, I appreciate everyone's attendance. Again, this has been recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. Christine, thank you so much for your fabulous presentation. And everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Take care, y'all.